Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, you recall from the previous episode we were installing some lighting, and of course as part of that was designing up the roof structure, so the ceilings, and then of course the rather simplified roof beam structure in order to support the roof. So in today's episode it's continuing on with that, and we're looking at the first layer of the roof panels themselves, and also in conjunction with that of course is the gable ends, so the reasonably ornate gable ends with of course the finials and the quite unique carved timber components to those gable ends. So there was quite a bit of experimenting that went on with this particular part of the build, and particularly to do with the gable ends. So we'll get into that and cover that, but we'll start off with the first layer of the roof structure. So I think without further ado, let's just jump into what I got up to. So with the roof substructure complete and ready to accept some roof panels, one of the things that I stumbled across and thought, I don't know how well this might work, and you may see a bit of a difference going on here in this central roof span. And what I did in the end, if you may recall, the wall used to extend up either side here to the apex, and it was pretty much like these end pieces but in here, and I almost sort of felt in the end they were superfluous. They didn't actually need to be there at all. And the roof structure itself, as per the method that I'm planning on using, you'll be able to take the roofs out. So the roof panels themselves, they're not actually going to be anchored to these sections here. For example, this end wall, they weren't going to be anchored to the end wall here that met up at the apex. They weren't going to be anchored to that. They were just simply just going to sit and rest on top of that. So I didn't really feel that it was necessary to have those. And then in doing so, removing these, which wasn't too much of a chore, you had to be reasonably careful with a steel rule and a blade to trim through I think it's 2mm MDF, cut through those and then just sort of tidy it up a bit. And I migrated extended the central roof span to have some additional support right at the end, and that means then that when I lift the roof off completely, of course, then there's even better access to the lighting plugs that are actually in either side in the two end units. So I just laser cut out some additional bits of MDF, 2mm MDF, some supporting caseboard as well, and extended the two further supports out to the end of that middle roof section. Of course, I had to factor in things like the plug and so forth at one end, which meant having to have a pre-cut hole, of course, for the plug to run through there. So once I'd actually got that sorted out, then it was a case of actually mapping out mostly on the computer the actual roof panels and the ridge lines and the valleys that run down in the corners. So it was a case of planning it out reasonably accurately to the plans that I had on the computer, working out through the pitch of the roof, working out the length and the width of each slope and so forth. And then it was a case of printing out the simple shapes onto some A4 paper and trimming them out. So what we've got here, these are probably more sort of at the final stages of the paper templates that I was producing, because despite the the reasonable accuracy of the plans on the computer. There's still going to be a little bit of a shift and a change and things like that, and then also just generally looking at it and going, you know, this could be extended a bit further, like the overhang of the roofs, or the overhang's too great, it could be reduced and so forth, because to a certain degree you sort of want the proportions. They might not be exactly to scale with the original station, but how proportionally they look in miniature. So these roof sections, for example, this one here, that's the roof section that went there, and this is, as I mentioned, these sort of templates were at their final stage. Of course, you can see we've got the notch there where the chimney breast will come through. This is the roof section for the other end, and also sort of factoring in the around here where the overhang is, but then where the central section of the station is and how that sort of fits in. And then of course our main section, and I hadn't actually, this template here doesn't have where the chimney slot is in it, and that sits in there. And this is where I was able to work out where these roofs converge at various sort of angles, so you can sort of see how these things work out, and also actually sort of working out the porch overhang, or the veranda here, canopy for the main entrance from the street side. So it was a bit of fine tuning and tweaking to get to this particular point. So once that was finalized, then it was a case of getting into actually finalizing the actual roof panels themselves, which are going to be laser cut from the 0.55mm black card. Now, interestingly, when I did the platform 2 building, I had printed out on label paper the guidelines for where the slate strips were going to be applied, and that was applied to the black card, and then the slate strips on top of that. And I remember somebody actually commenting on, why didn't you just sort of laser cut the guidelines actually in the black card? And at the time I'd actually done that as a test, and it just didn't actually show up very well. But I thought I'd have another crack at it and see if there's a way I could adjust the laser cutter to make the line more visible. But the main thing is for it to not cut all the way through the card, or literally not cut through the card at all, because then that's just going to weaken the structure. It's purely there as a guideline. So when it came to doing that, I actually managed to work out a setting, and it may be a bit tricky to see that on the camera, but I was able to get a setting where it's not cut into it all. It's almost like it's scribed it. It's scribed the lines, but it has actually scribed it enough where I can actually clearly see the lines as the guide for where to apply the strips of slate as they're laid up the roof. So these are the laser cut roof sections here, and we've got our 3 components. So if we can move our templates out of the way, and bring this in, and these are our roof sections. So the 2 outer roof sections go on first, and then of course we now have our slot where the chimney breast comes up for this one, and that's all the roof sections. And I think it's definitely looking the part. Now, one of the things you'll instantly notice, well, where's the canopy roof gone? Now, I decided in the end to actually make that separately, because rather than, even though, interestingly, of course, with their recent videos that Laura and Gil have posted on their channel, when the builders started stripping their tiles off the slate off their roof, and there was some really excellent video footage there for me to reference. And of course the slate actually on the street side actually goes all the way down to the bottom of the canopy, so it's not a separate section of roof or slate on the canopy roof. So this is our canopy substructure, and of course this is laser cut, so I didn't do a 3D version of this. I felt that laser cutting this was a better process for doing that, so that's what's going to go there. And then the actual roof section for that is a separate piece, once again with its scribed grooves in it, and that's going to sit up under there. So that's how that's all sort of been mapped out. So the chimney breasts themselves, now what I've decided to do there is do the base section of the chimney breasts, at least do that, and not worry too much about the rest of the chimney at this point. So as long as I create the base section, then we can add the rest of the chimney later. The main thing is to have that base section as part of the roof structure and the roof pitch from the outset. So the chimney breasts were designed up in laser cut on the 1.25mm case board, and then wrapped with the brick texture, and they were designed in such a way as so that they actually mount into the roof substructure and become a fixed component of the actual roof substructure, which then protrudes through the roof panels themselves. So I'll just lift off this section here, and this is our little chimney breast section for down at that end, and it's got this little wee V shape in the lower part of it, and that actually slots onto the top of that ridge. And that's another reason why I decided to get rid of those original extended or higher wall sections that went up to an apex, because otherwise this really wouldn't have worked for doing that, because the idea is that this whole piece can lift off. So if we can imagine, this will be glued to that, and then down here at this end we've got this is a smaller chimney breast, and that's actually going to slide either side of this supporting ridge and line up down there with where the wires come through for the lighting. So that's our two chimney breasts there. Now if I slot this over, and that's how they'll come through, and then we've got this area up here that we can then add to. There'll be separate chimney components that will slot inside those components, which is where the step is roughly. As you'll see with the chimney breast, the base is wider, it's at least a brick wider all the way around, then it gets thinner, and then of course it gets wider again at the top. And then this one, whoops, it's probably not going to stay there while I slot this in. Let's just see if I can. Actually, I'll put the roof on and then slot this in. So that's our chimney breasts that are protruding up. So as you can imagine, I went through quite a bit of experimentation when it came to the gable ends and the finials, and my initial thought was the finials I would 3D print, and the gable ends themselves I would laser cut. So this version here is a combination of the two. So we've got our 3D printed finial here, and then we've got the laser cut, which is the 0.55mm black card. And it worked to a certain degree. I mean, once it's painted up it would look okay, but I guess the issue I found is there's a bit of a kind of a beading on the very upper edge of the gable ends themselves, and although it's hard to pick it out from photos and so forth, it looks like it might be scalloped in some way. And so of course with laser cutting you can't go as far as doing that. So of course the edges of this are just simply a thin strip of the 0.55mm black card, but it's so thin that it was quite tricky trying to apply that, and it sort of came unstuck and it gets bent and things like that. So that was one of the drawbacks, I guess, in terms of laser cutting the gable component, and then of course the back has got the finial was split basically in half, so it's similar to this one here, and then stuck together to create the whole shape. So that sort of went out the window in the end, that one there, and then we sort of looked at 3D printing the entire structure. So that's the finial and the gable ends, and I started sort of experimenting with that. And this is a version, not sure at what point this version came out, but one of the things I actually found is that once again this would still need to be printed in two halves, so that you got the back half and the front half. And this was an early version, I'm not quite sure when, and then we moved into this version here. Now this is just the front half of the gable end, and this is where I was able to model in the sort of scalloped beading that runs down the upper edge, and it can be seen in the 3D file, the Tinkercad file, where I was able to model that, so it would actually print that. And it's very fine, it's very small, it's almost superfluous, but nonetheless I really wanted to give it a go and try it out. So you'll notice that the cross member here is got a gap in it, and this was a later modification in order to map out how the finial was actually going to lock into the gable end structure. So that is designed in such a way as so that the gable end will sit in there, because not forgetting there's two layers to this. So this is another version here, and this is where I've actually stuck the front and the back together. So that's the printed section of the back and the front that's applied. But this is still an earlier version where later on I actually modify the back of it, so that we've actually got a lip on the back which can then be actually glued to the roof substrate or the roof card. So yeah, it certainly went for a few processes, and further on in this video we'll get into the assembly of the final version of these, and the different components that are printed separately but then all come together at the end. So there's two further experimental versions here, and the main difference between these two is you can see here the bottom ends of the gable are complete, so they've got this decorative shape to it, and then here you'll see, well, there's a chunk missing out of the bottom ends. Now this was another aspect that I came across as I was going through all the experimentation, is that on the platform side, of course, we've got the canopy, and so on closer inspection, and fortunately there's some photos where the canopy is in place, and then of course after the canopy's been removed, and sure enough the bottom of the gable ends are actually cut away. And it sort of led me to believe whether originally when the station was first built that the canopy was never meant to be part of the plan, and that the canopy was added in at a later stage, and they had to hack away at the bottom of the gable ends to fit the canopy. So I'm not too sure, but then in saying that, of course, there is some remnants of wrought iron I-beam or girder embedded in the stonework of the station that suggests that the canopy was installed at the time the station was constructed. So yeah, it's a bit unusual in that sense. So hence why this one here, this gable end, has got these chunks out of it to accommodate the glass canopy. So if the part's now printed out, we can now assemble each of these components into one unit. And as I mentioned, there were many variations of the design until I arrived at this particular design, which I sort of felt was really the easiest way of putting this all together. So the flatbed for the build plate on the 3D printer, I actually use a glue stick, because that really does help with making sure the parts actually stay on the build plate and you don't get them lifting up. So what I do need to do before I can actually glue any of this together is just clean off any of the glue residue. So I'm just using a bit of IPA on a cotton bud to clean off the residue, and this also helps when it comes to the bonding as well anyway, just to clean these up. So as I mentioned, the idea behind these individual components is to avoid having to design in or add in supports during 3D printing process, and because these are sort of flat, mostly flat components, I just think it's easier that way to do that as flat components that can be assembled afterwards. There's two different glues that I'm using for this, and the reason behind it is I use the super glue to glue these two components together, so essentially the two halves of the main gable structure together. So I use super glue for that because that's pretty much instant and that's set. And then for these finials I actually use a bit of Humbrol poly cement, which it's not quite as instant. It gives me an opportunity to slide the two components around and get them in the right position. But because I've used the super glue on the main gable structure, it's fixed in place, and I'm not worried about, I don't need to worry about it sliding about or these components moving about as I'm trying to put these components on. So hence the reason for the two different glues. So what I've actually done is I've just got a engineer's set square here, and I've just actually taped it to a bit of card to raise it up a little bit for the level, so this can actually tuck into this corner, and that's basically going to add as a jig to put these two together. So it's a little bit tricky. So because it's super glue, it goes off pretty much instantly once they're stuck together. So I've really got to make sure that the two corners butt up into that top corner there, so that we end up with the two components aligned nice and flush. So we'll apply a bit of glue to the back side of this, and I'm just using Gorilla Super Glue, which comes with its own brush applicator. I've found this to actually be the best way of doing this, and I basically brush off the most of the excess glue, because what I'm trying to do is avoid too much glue oozing out the sides of the two components. So we're just spreading a very thin bead of this super glue down the middle, and it's already stuck to my finger. How about that? The interesting thing is I've already done the other three of these, which I'll present shortly, and they all went without hitch, and I didn't glue myself to any of these components. So as soon as we get the camera out, we enter various complications. So lining that up in there, butt that up in the corner, and that certainly wasn't as successful. And I think, you know, partly the reason is because I'm filming this now, and this is to go into as part of the content for the video, you get a little bit nervous that it's going to actually cock up, and so you get all jittery, and before you know it, you've actually made mincemeat of it compared to the ones that you did off camera. So it's par for the course, unfortunately, that kind of stuff. So regardless of that, I think we've successfully glued these two components together. The critical thing is that the edges here are flush around the top edge, because this is where the slate is actually going to overlap that edge. So yeah, so I think we're okay with that. So we'll set that aside, and it probably would actually help if I put on my stronger glasses for doing this. That probably wasn't so good using my weaker glasses. So what we've got here is, it's the finials split roughly down the middle, as would have been seen in the 3D models on the computer, and the back side of the finial, which you're not really going to see a great deal, but it's been modelled anyway, is in two parts. So technically, in a way, really, there's actually 5 parts to this assembly process, but what I've actually done is just kept the 2 parts to this together. So with just a little sprue here that's connecting the two together, just so on the build plate it's not all just going to completely fall apart or we end up losing a part. So we chop that piece off, because this is just a thin sprue that's just basically holding them together, and that's the top half of the finial. And then we're going to slot this in, and at the moment this will fit in here into this section, up into this corner and through the cross member, and it's all been designed up so it's supposed to fit perfectly. And this is where we're going to use the Humbrol poly cement, which is this stuff here, and it is a snug fit. So at the moment what you're actually looking at is, this is the front face of the Gable, and the back is face down on the tabletop. So I just do a quick test fit just to make sure that we're lined up, and it's got to fit either side of this cross member. So apply a bit of glue to the tab here, and get my tweezers for this actually, and then a little bit of glue goes into the notch where the cross member is going to run through, and then this gets butted up and right up into that top corner, and I'm just bringing in this to push that onto the cross member. So that's why there was that notch or section missing out of the back side of the cross member, because this is how this slots in, and then what we end up now is this whole piece through here is now flush the top surface. And just checking the back, even though that will never be seen really. And with that in place, then it's a case of spreading some more of the Humbrol poly cement. Now for some reason, not sure quite why, but this poly cement is good in the sense it's more like a gel than a liquid, and it's good in the sense that it doesn't grip straight away. So you've got a little bit of an opportunity to slide this around, and this is quite important for this finial section, because it's got those sort of grooves, turned grooves at various points. It's really, well, I mean, it's reasonably important, I should say. I'll not say really important, but reasonably important that they all line up. The turned sections actually wrap 360. So we've got that in place and that's looking good. And then finally on the rear side of the finial, because we need the other half of it, this is what this tiny little wee piece is here. And of course we need to trim out the sprue that's left into this groove in there. And we'll just do another test fit to see how this is looking. Yep, and that's going to fit in there. And then once again a little bit of the Humbrol poly cement. So that's the process of putting the gable ends and the finials together, and these are the ones that I'd completed earlier. Some of course have got glue spillage on them, but it'll be fine because of course they're all going to get painted. And so I'll go over these with a primer, grey primer, which will just sort of fill in where there is a bit of print banding from the 3D printer, and then of course they're going to be in that sort of red colour, deep sort of red colour. So some of you might be wondering why I didn't just simply split the entire sort of gable and finial structure in half and just do two halves and put them together. And the reason behind that is I really needed to, the finials needed to be split through halfway through, and of course they're not centered within the entire structure if you're looking at on a flat plane. So to do that you'd end up with printing the one half of the gable structure would actually be off the print bed, and you can see the gap underneath. And so in order to do that, the software and the printer needs supports, and I did have a crack at it, and there's the ability to auto-generate supports, and it just looked like such a nightmare that I didn't even go ahead with it, because I thought, gosh, I've got to trim all of those supports off. And so that's really the reason why the components are printed as they are and assembled in the way it's assembled, because it avoids doing that, avoids any kind of supports, and it avoids things like sprues to a certain degree, apart from the back side of the finial. So there we have it so far, and even though this is really just the base structure for the roof line and the pitch and things like that, you can actually now begin to see the overall appearance of the station and its proportions, which is really quite interesting. So in the next episode, of course, we'll be getting on to the slate finish that's going to be applied to the roof, and then also continue on with the gable ends and the finials. So I have applied a primer to those, but we've got to continue on with the red as well. And while we're working with the gable ends at this end, of course, and the canopy that's coming out in front here, I've now got to actually work out the inner canopy, which goes in here. So there was an inner canopy at one point which also had a glass roof. Now this might actually be quite interesting in doing this, and well, I guess maybe for in terms of Law & Gill, that they've of course removed the 1980s canopy that was slapped in front of the station there, and I must admit, now that it's gone, it looks so much better. So Law & Gill, I definitely think you made the right decision there. But of course one of the problems is they've lost their outdoor cover if it's pouring with rain. So maybe, and it's possibly something that maybe Law & Gill might consider, is do they restore the original inner canopy, so which of course would include the two wrought iron posts that they've still got, and make that out of glass, and it only comes out a short way, in which case you're still going to let the light into the rooms inside, and it's also going to not block off all the beautiful brickwork and stonework that you can see. So maybe that's a possibility. So hopefully I'll get into that in the next episode, and we'll begin to actually see what that might actually look like, and maybe that might actually be something quite valuable for Laura and Gil to have a look at. So I'll leave it there for today's episode. I certainly hope you've gained some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts and model building exercises. Do take care, look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.